Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
Hey everyone, welcome to the second edition of the Archaeology News. And as you're probably aware if you occasionally watch the news, DNA is just creating new headlines every day. And in my world, that's ancient DNA. And the first story is about just that. So, there was a study done of some 1,617 ancient genomes, 317 of those from Europe, and the remainder from Eurasia. These were compared with 410,000 genomes and other personal information profiles of white British individuals. And you'll understand why that's important in a moment. These are modern individuals. And in it, there were some startling findings about multiple sclerosis. Now, if you don't know what multiple sclerosis is, this is a disease that affects the nervous system, heavily women by a 4-to-1 ratio, and typically after the age of 30. There are some pretty recognizable people who have the disease, and it's mostly women, but not exclusively. And believe it or not, this terrible disease, at least according to the conclusions of this study, seems to come from something that was once an adaptive evolutionary advantage. So how on earth could that be? So here we go. The modern European population is comprised of 6 distinct different genetic populations that all came into Europe. But for now, to simplify things, we're going to focus on 3 of them. The first, some 45,000 years ago, were Asian hunter-gatherers. So they came from the East, and they settled into Europe. 9,000 years ago, there were farmers. So this was the beginning of sort of the Neolithic period from the Middle East. And then 5,000 years ago, there were a pastoralist population. So those mean shepherds, people who reared animals, from what's called the Eurasian steppe. That's Western Russia and present-day Ukraine. These were called the Yamnaya people, so the Yamnaya culture. So this latter group, the Yamnaya people, they went all over the place, again, had a big influence on modern languages, but they seem to have stayed more and have had the strongest influence in Northern Europe. So the people in Northern Europe sort of bear more of their traits. Tall, light in complexion, blue-eyed. These are generally understood to be traits inherited by the Yamnaya. Incidentally, the descendants of the Middle Eastern farming population that came in 9,000 years ago before the Yamnaya, well, they are more firmly ensconced in Southern Europe, which is why to this day, people in Southern Europe are darker in complexion and shorter than people in Northern Europe. However, Europeans tend to have these 3 populations in their genetic background just to varying degrees. So, scientists from Cambridge University took that sampling of ancient DNA, the 1,617, 317 of those from ancient Europeans, and 1,300 of them from Eurasians. These are people who lived anywhere from 3,000 to 11,000 years ago. And what they did is they compared those genomes to that big bank of modern white British people, that 410,000 people. And they did that because, as we know, Europe today is a very diverse place with a lot of people who have immigrated relatively recently. What we were looking for in this study is people who have their long, deep roots in Europe without a lot of other external influences. And here's where MS, multiple sclerosis, comes in. So this is a disease that affects predominantly European people. They are much more likely to have this than other populations in the world, and particularly people from Northern Europe, where that Yamnaya blood is strong. So MS is caused essentially by an overactive immune system.
The force is strong in this way.
That then acts to attack its own neuron cells. In the context of Yamnaya pastoralists who are constantly around their animals, this was actually a benefit. Think about mad cow disease. That's a really deadly neurological disease if humans catch it. The adaptation to have this overactive immune system attacking a neurological disease spread by animals would have actually been a benefit for these people in constant contact with animals. And in that sense, it was probably an adaptive advantage for them. Unfortunately, the downside is MS. But I know what you're thinking. If this genetic predilection actually wound up causing MS, wouldn't natural selection have caused the people carrying these genes to die off? Well, not so fast. Remember how natural selection works. Mother Nature does not care if you live a long time, does not care if you're comfortable, doesn't care if you're happy. The way natural selection works is those members of a species and species who are better adapted to reproduce, they're the ones whose genetic material survives, and that influences their descendants. Remember, MS primarily strikes people who are above the age of 30, and even 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, that was long after most women gave birth to their first child. Thinking about thousands of years ago, that first child probably came to a lot of women in their younger and mid-teens, long before the appearance of MS. So from the point of view of evolution, once you've had that baby, that's all we care about, not what happens after. And hence, there's much more MS in Europe and Northern Europe, where the Yamnaya left their strongest stamp on the population. This reminds me of another study from 2022, so not that long ago, which discussed an area in present-day Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, where historical accounts seem to point to a terrible pestilence that struck the area in the 14th century. Archaeologists actually excavated 2 cemeteries in this region from 1885 to 1892. And believe it or not, material still exists from those excavations somewhere. And it turns out a number of the graves in these cemeteries actually attested specifically to the deaths of these people being caused by a terrible pestilence in 1338 and 1339. So what present-day scientists did is actually sequence the genomes of 7 people from these cemeteries with the inscriptions, and it actually found the genetic imprint of what would later become the Black Death. So they actually identified the birthplace of the Black Death from this little area in Kyrgyzstan. That's the culprit. Absolutely amazing. One more historical mystery solved thanks to archaeology, specifically ADNA. And as you know, archaeology is a discipline that covers an incredible range of material, from stuff as tiny as DNA, now to something much, much bigger. I'm going to talk about a recent LIDAR survey. LIDAR stands for Light Detection and Ranging. First developed in the 1960s, the use of LIDAR in archaeology really came to fruition in the 2000s as the technology became cheaper and lighter, and hence could be deployed off of even smallish drones. Now, what LIDAR does is these lasers...
Begin laser ignition sequence.
Begin laser ignition!
are sort of strong enough to penetrate forest cover and topsoil to map things below the ground. Now, how does that work? Essentially, the LIDAR system can calculate the time and then hence translate that into distance that it takes for that laser beam to bounce back to the drone, if it's being deployed from a drone. And the result of that, this sort of time distance calculations, is sort of an elevation map of those features underneath the ground. And you'll see lots of examples of this as we talk. Now, this has been a gold mine for the practice of archaeology in many ways. And one of the key ways is it's essentially resource saving. So long ago, as in like 10 years ago, or even sometimes now when there isn't the ability to use LIDAR, archaeologists would have to do a ground survey and try to find the place where they thought there was stuff to be found. And a lot of times this was a lot of guesswork and very hit or miss. Well, now using LIDAR, they have a pretty good idea where the stuff is that they're looking for. So it actually makes digging much more efficient, a lot lower failure rate if you already know that there's something under there. And this is so important because archaeology is resource starved. And though archaeologists love to dig, the money is often just not there for it. Anyway, like just about every oversexed archaeology story that breaks into the headlines nowadays, this story involves LIDAR changing everything we know about the course of history. Archaeologists are left perturbed, astounded, puzzled. Yeah. Let's just get to the story. So, the Ecuadorian government conducted a LIDAR survey of an area called the Upano Valley that's in the center of the country in an area of the Amazon, that vast rainforest in the tropics of South America. Now, from the looks of the photos, it looks like some of this area has been deforested, unfortunately, which, as we know, happened already to much of the Amazon. And what they found was astounding. This was an area about 300 square kilometers or about 115 square miles. So, what did they find? They found over 6,000 platforms, and subsequently targeted excavations of these revealed that some of them were probably houses, while some of them seemed to be used for other public or, dare we say, ritual purposes. They found 15 distinct settlements home to at least 10,000 people, but probably a lot more. It's very difficult to tell without extensive excavations, and even with excavations, there's a lot of guesswork involved. Now, these settlements were linked by roads, straight roads, wide roads, some of them as wide as 10 meters or 33 feet, and long roads, some as long as 16 miles or over 25 kilometers. Now, the fact that these roads were straight tells us some important things. Remember, it's a lot harder to build a straight road than it is one that just sort of naturally follows the contours of the land. This means these people had understanding of sort of advanced construction, engineering, and mathematical techniques, which is pretty amazing considering the age of the site. Carbon dating suggests that these sites were built about 2,500 years ago and were inhabited for about 1,000 years. So we're basically overlapping totally with the Roman period, meaning there was a civilization in South America that had advanced road building techniques at that time in the Amazon forest. Now, also, they found some evidence of defensive works. So what we're seeing is massive public engineering and construction projects. Unbelievable. All of this points to the existence of this previously unknown sophisticated civilization that could build these massive things. Imagine it's basically like a Maya or Aztec or Inca civilization unknown sitting beneath the Amazon forest. This is particularly surprising given the supposed consensus prior to these findings that there was really no large-scale settlements in the Amazon region in ancient times. It was thought that there were just small groups of people who didn't leave much of a trace. It was also a particular personal triumph for one Professor Stéphane Rostand, who's the Director of Investigation at the National Center for Scientific Research in France. He had found evidence decades ago of these settlements on the ground doing archaeology, but he was warned not to pursue this line of investigation considering that so-called consensus. And so in challenging it, that would be career suicide. So what did he do? Like any good archaeologist, he continued to look for this civilization like a dog with a bone and challenge that consensus. So you know what they say, if at first you don't succeed, try, and try again. And that's just what he did, culminating in this study. Personally, what I'd be interested to know is, these Upano people, did they clear the forest? In other words, at the time this civilization flourished, was the area forested or was it cleared, and to what extent was it cleared? The reason I ask this is previously different lines of archaeological evidence have actually upended similar assumptions in a place like Britain, where LIDAR, archaeobotany, and other things have led us to understand that the island was not always just this mass forested place until the Industrial Revolution. It was not just like Sherwood Forest or something. And as I previously mentioned on the show, the island actually had experienced periods of changing vegetation, and reforestation. So I'm curious to know what this region of the Amazon looked like over time. Anyway, this is all thanks to our good friend LIDAR. It's a good thing.
Now, that's a good thing.
Okay, so this last story is from the middle of last year, but in the world of academic publishing, that's like a nanosecond. And it concerns my research anyway, and I've been writing about it, so we're going to do it because it's my show. This concerns early medieval Britain, also known as the Dark Ages, also known as the Anglo-Saxon period. Why did it get these names? Well, it's called the Dark Ages because there's almost nothing written about it. In fact, there are really just two sources. One is written by a pretty mad monk named Gildas, who's writing a religious polemic. The other is a longer and more carefully written account that does claim to be a history, written by a guy called the Venerable Bede, who's considered Britain's first historian. Now, according to Bede, after the Romans evacuated Britain, there was groups of people called Anglos and Saxons and also Jutes who moved into England, conquered the place, and that's also what Gildas said. He sort of intimated that there was a mass slaughter and these Anglo-Saxons conquered the people there and pushed them further west into places like Wales and Scotland. But we know it's actually a lot more complicated than that. What caused all these Anglo-Saxons coming from places like northern Germany and southern Denmark? What made them decide to come to Britain and snap up all this cheap real estate? Don't know. How did they come and do this? Were they conquerors, really? Were they peaceful migrants? There's been some suggestions that they actually didn't really come in large numbers and that the locals just sort of adopted their culture through trade or some other means, kind of the same way that, let's say, people from the former Soviet Union adopted Western fashions at the end of the Cold War. And in fact, Bede himself mentions a lot more people other than the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes who came. He mentioned the Bructeri, the Rugi, the Frisians, the Old Saxons, and it's not really clear who all these folks were. We know they generally came from the North Sea zone, from southern Scandinavia and northern Germany. But were they political entities? Were they distinct ethnicities? Did they see themselves as those people, or were those just titles condoned on them later by people like Bede? We don't know. Did this happen because of a vanguard of high-status conquering men who were then followed by their families? Or did we have the settling of whole families of peasants? We just don't know. So you get the picture. There's a lot we don't know, and there's a reason it's called the Dark Ages. So there you go. Well, what we do have in spades is thousands and thousands of burials on both sides of the English Channel from this period. And there was one particular item which is the subject of this study I'm going to discuss. And that are these small ivory rings which are found at the hips of women in their burials. And these ivory rings were probably like holders for bags at the women's belts. Now, for a long time, this was just taken for granted as an accessory. Like at that time, there was something called girdle hangers. And that was it. It was assumed they were probably made out of walrus tusk ivory or something else in the area. Well, some smart applications of scientific techniques has changed all of this thinking. A group of researchers, and I'll point out that the first one listed as an author, Katie Himmer, is at UCL where I study as a bioarchaeologist. They applied scientific techniques, particularly three, that produced some astounding results. First, radiocarbon dating confirmed that the ivory rings themselves were from the 5th and 6th centuries, so reasonably contemporaneous with the burials, not some ancient artifact or something. Second, strontium analysis, which is something I discussed in the B is for bioarchaeology episode, that confirmed that the source of this ivory, so where the animals were from, was actually probably in East Africa, so nowhere near any of these people. Third and finally, mass spectrometry, a complex process that I don't totally understand and certainly can't fully explain, but here goes. It essentially measures the mass to charge ratio of ions, and apparently different species will sort of leave a different signature in this regard. And in this case, the material was, I believe, collagen from the ivory. I think that was the case. And it turns out that the signature that the mass spectrometer produced matched that of elephants. So wow, the implications of this are amazing. Let's put it all together for a moment. What this means is that somebody killed some elephants in East Africa, probably Ethiopia, and rings made from the ivory somehow made their way to Britain and northern Germany, because there are rings found there, just not quite as many as in England. In England, I think they found something like 70 plus of these. Now, some other findings. Archaeology suggests that these rings were probably imported in their finished form into Britain because the technology for working ivory and polishing and all of that was in abundance in the Mediterranean. It's also unlikely that the rings made it directly from Africa or the Mediterranean into Britain and Germany. They probably passed through a complex trade network to get there. So what this means is Britain, which was at the time considered a poor backwater at the edge of the earth, had something valuable enough to trade for ivory rings, and that there were trade networks that linked it. That really flips the script, and it introduces this sort of commerce at such an early stage in the development of what would later become England. Moreover, there's a lot more that can be learned. Assuming ivory rings in Germany come up with similar results, and we should test just to be sure, that would actually allow us to link specific communities on both sides of the channels. So origin communities in northern Germany and destination communities in England. Secondly, if we test the DNA and the strontium and all of that from the bodies associated with this ivory, that will tell us a lot about how these people came to England and transmitted their culture. Were they immigrants from Germany? The DNA and strontium could tell that. Were they Germanic people who were now second or third generation? The DNA and strontium would tell us that. Are they actually mixed people? So the result of unions between native Britons and immigrants? Or are these merely Britons who adopted a Germanic fashion trend? Because Germany to this day remains a fashion powerhouse. Didn't you know?
So now's the time on Sprockets when we dance.
Why this is also important is because to this day there remains some big unanswered questions, producing an often spirited and sometimes downright nasty debate.
If I did not get these queens to sign a peace deal soon, I would not become famous.
Who were these Anglo-Saxons? Where exactly did they come from? Were they conquerors or were they settlers? These are all questions that remain unanswered, and incidentally, this will probably be the focus of my future doctoral thesis. So, this does shed light on a lot of these questions, and science, especially aDNA and strontium, is beginning to do that. So these ivory rings are just one more piece of the puzzle that really can, for the first time, link specific communities on both sides of the channel and tell us something about the nature of their settlement in Britain. As you can see, all this science stuff really jazzes me up, even though I can't do it at all. And if you like this sort of content, I'd recommend you check out one site, and they have social media, called IFL Science, or I Love Science. They have great content, and I think you should check it out if you like this story. All right, so that's what I've got for you today. Ancient DNA, LIDAR, and ivory rings, all brought to you by Archaeological Science, which, as you can see, is producing some amazing results. All right, signing off. Hey, If you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.